Three. Hello everybody. In a earlier video we took a look at working with squash and stretch, and we made a ball that jumps, something like this. In this video we're going to take a look at some of the things that we learned from creating this jumping ball and apply it to a character. We're going to see how we can take a character and animate it to do a jump. So if we scrub through this animation, we can see, when we're looking at the ball here, that if I scrub in the animation, first the ball anticipates its jump by squashing, and then it very quickly does the action, or jumps, comes up, comes down, and then reacts to its landing. We're going to do all of those same things with this character here. But first we'll keep it very, very simple. So currently I have selected the root, the hip of my character here, which I'm going to do the jump with. And I'll go ahead and key that. Scrub in my timeline, looking at the ball that we have here, we're going to animate it very similarly. So on perhaps frame 21, we'll have it crouch down or squash into its action before it goes into its jump. And we'll key that. And then we'll have it go into its jump. The ball looks like it peaks at about frame 36. I'm going to go ahead and bring my character up similarly on frame 36. Notice that this rig actually has a stretchy leg setup, but we'll deal with that in a little bit. I'll key that. Ball comes down. Bring our character down. In fact, we'll take a look at the ball that comes down and it reacts to landing. We'll do something very similar. And then the ball recovers. And we'll have our character do the same. So let's see what we have here. We'll go ahead and play this animation. And there's what we have so far. Now, when we looked at the jumping ball example weeks ago in that earlier video, you may remember that we worked with its animation curves here in the graph editor. And here is the animation curve for the movement, the up and down movement of my jumping ball. And what you'll notice is that we have slow in, slow out at the top of the jump, but at the point where the ball actually lifts off, I don't really have any slow out. It comes out very quickly. And when it lands, or as it comes towards the ground, the ball gets faster and faster until it hits the ground here. We're going to do something very similar with our jump animation with the character. So I will select, once again, this control here, the hip control that we have here, and we'll go ahead and go into its graph editor, or into the graph editor. It's not a different graph editor. And we can make those adjustments here. We can do it a couple different ways. We can do it by breaking the tangent, for example, and then grabbing the handle and moving it like this. We could also free the tangent weights. We'll stick with this method for the time being, breaking the tangents and then adjusting the tangents so that we're eliminating that slow out here, and we're keeping in fact, we're exaggerating the slow in, slow out here, because as you can see, by adjusting this handle here, like this, it is affecting this area here. It's increasing the slow in, it's increasing the slow out when I adjust these two handles. These two handles here. Let's see what this looks like now. And that starts to look a little bit more convincing physically. So perhaps the next thing we would want to do with this particular example is start working on the feet, since we've got that stretchy legs set up. But I don't think we actually want the legs to stretch like that as the character jumps. So what I'll do is select the foot controls here, and we'll start animating those. So perhaps if I scrub in here and look at my animation, I'm thinking maybe we'll keep the feet planted on frame 22. The character will jump, the character comes back down, perhaps around frame 50, maybe the feet will land. But at the peak of the jump, we're going to want to bring the feet up. And I'll go ahead and key that. And we'll go ahead and play the animation and see how that's looking. Okay, so looking good so far. I think what I'll do is take these foot controls and do something similar to what I did at the root of our skeleton here. We'll work with the animation curves in the graph editor. So I'll select both those foot controls, and we'll go to the graph editor and look at its translate Y values. In fact, if you remember, what I did was I broke the tangent, and then I grabbed this handle like this and moved it. That's how I adjusted and increased the slow in, slow out here, and eliminated the slow in here, or sorry, eliminated the slow out here and eliminated the slow in here. I'm going to show you the second way to do that with this example, however. What I'm going to do is select these two translate Y curves. They're right on top of one another right now, so it only looks like one. And I'm going to right click in here and say weighted tangents. You'll notice that the handle changed, but I can grab this handle and I can simply pull it in this way, grab this handle, pull it in this way. And I can grab this one as well and pull it out to increase that slow in, slow out. This is simply a second way of accomplishing this goal of increasing the slow in, slow out here and eliminating it at the beginning and at the end of the jump here. You can choose which way you prefer, but it's good to be familiar with both methods. Let's take a look at what the animation looks like. And there it is. Now, you could probably use a little bit of refining. Right now, I think that the feet are actually traveling a little too quickly going up like that. They should remain straightened for longer. So I'll go back to my graph editor And we'll just try perhaps decreasing that slow in, slow out at the peak of our animation here. As you can see, that'll have the effect here of straightening those legs somewhat. In fact, while I'm at it, maybe I'll go ahead and set another key. And we'll position the feet like this, key that as well. And here's what we have so far. So if we scrub through this animation, you'll see that both the jumping ball and our character here have many of the same elements in them. In other words, they both anticipate their jump. So we have the anticipation first. They go into the action and come out of it very, very quickly, and they jump up. They come up here and have some slow in and slow out as gravity starts to pull them back down to earth. They both land, and they both have some follow-through overlapping action. In other words, not everything stops at once. When it hits the ground, in the case of the ball and in the case of the character, they both continue going as they absorb that energy before they return back to their normal position. Now, what I've done here is not obviously the best jump animation. It's actually quite boring. Why? Well, first of all, our character is in T pose, not the best way to start a jump animation. It would be better to first position the character or put the character into a more natural looking pose before even starting with this animation. And then we would animate it. It's better to first, as I said, position the character in a natural looking pose, an appropriate pose, and then start animating it. The reason for my doing it this way initially was simply because I wanted to show you at a very simple level how much of what you did earlier with the jumping ball will also be applied to a character. In fact, when you did this jumping ball animation, more or less you were animating the ball as if it were a character. Great. Now, before you start your jump animation, I'd like to give you a few pointers that I think will be helpful for you. So I've started my jump animation, and as I had mentioned before, I do not recommend starting your animation in the T pose. First, establish an initial pose for your animation, as I have done here. I've tried to give my character something of an action stance that's definitely more interesting than the character simply being in the T pose, something that looks a little bit more natural, something that's a little bit more appropriate for this character and his personality. So that's what I've done here. I've posed the character before I even start animating. Another pointer that can be very helpful for you is to establish a camera, which is another thing that you will notice I've done here. I've got my working cameras, my perspective, my side, my front, and then I made this viewport my own camera. I called it camera, I created a camera, I called it my camera, and that's the camera that I'm working to. So I've established the camera, I've established the composition for my animation here. And yet another thing that I've done that makes animating easier is that I've put all my meshes and everything I don't want to accidentally select into a layer here. And you'll notice that my layer is set on the third box to R for reference. So what this means is that I cannot select my mesh because it's on this layer here. that's been set to R for reference, meaning that you can see it, but you cannot select it. In fact, I've also put my ground plane in that same layer, so I cannot select it either. So what does this do for me? Well, if we look at my rig and my character, you can see that this is going to make it very easy for me to select all the controls on my character. That way, if I want to animate everything on my character at one time, I can easily do so simply by selecting the animation controls and pressing S on my keyboard to key it. In addition, I'll point this out as well. If I go in my viewport to show, you'll notice that right now I have everything visible in here. I don't need to have everything visible. So if I say none, nothing will be visible in my viewport. If I say show polygons, just the polygons in my scene will be visible. And if I come over here and go to show and say NURBS curves, then all my animation controls that are NURBS curves will be visible as well. This makes it a little bit easier to see just what you want to see and what you need to see as you're animating. Now, one of the things that is difficult about animating a character as opposed to a jumping ball or a bouncing ball is the number of animation controls you have. So if we look at this character, you'll notice that there's a lot of different animation controls on here. Everything from a control to animate and pose the head, the arm, the elbow, and so on. It consists of a lot of controls. And because of this, animation can get quite complicated because you're dealing with lots of different animation controls at one time. So my recommendation when animating is first establish your key poses. And I've done that already, and I will show you now. I haven't really adjusted the animation curves yet. I haven't got the timing down quite yet. But if I play this, you'll see that my character has all the parts in my jump animation here. What you'll notice if I select all my controls, so I currently have all of my animation controls selected, and I recommend you do this when you animate because then this will allow you to make sure that you have everything keyed on your character. Now, I've got everything keyed on frame 1, so this is one of my key poses here. If we scrub to frame 20, this is my anticipation, and you'll see that I in fact have everything keyed here on frame 20. If I scrub to 24, this is just before the character is going to lift off the ground. This could be another key pose here, so I will key that as well. I've keyed frame 36, where the character will come up to the apex of their jump. Once again, I selected all the controls on my character, and I keyed that as well. 48 is just as the character lands. That's going to be one of my key poses, so I key everything on all of the controls there. 55, the character goes into their squash as they react to hitting the ground after landing, so I keyed everything there. And then finally, the character returns to the original pose because I made this a looping animation. Your animation does not have to be a looping animation, but mine is. And I keyed that as well. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 key poses here. Now, if you want to be able to focus on just looking at your poses without really thinking about how it interpolates from one pose to another pose, here's a little trick that you can do. So I have all my controls selected. I'm going to go to my animation editor, graph editor, and I'm going to select all of the animation curves here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make them into a stepped curve. So if I select that, let's see what that did. I'll play my animation, and you'll notice that now it is not doing any interpolation in between your poses. Why is this helpful? Well, it allows me to concentrate on just getting the poses right first without really worrying about the in-betweens, about these in-betweens, let's say between frame 24 and 36, for example. Now, using these stepped keys, as I've done here, is really useful when you're trying to establish your poses. But once you're ready to start animating in between your key poses, or in other words, doing your in-betweens, you're going to want to have the animation interpolating in between your keyframes. So I'm going to return to my graph editor, and I'll select all of my curves just so that you can see this. This is everything animated in my character. And as you can see, that's a lot of different objects. Each one of those objects oftentimes with multiple channels. That's what makes this very confusing at times. What I'm going to do is change this back from stepped curves to or more kind of regular curves here. And now when I play this, you'll see that it is interpolating, although it looks a little bit rough now. But at this stage, I can start coming in here and really working on those in-betweens, adding more keyframes in between on the various different parts of the body. And I can also work on the animation curves in the graph editor, as you have done already with the bouncing ball animations that we've created, the pendulum, the hammer and nail animation, all of those animations. Another thing I'd like to remind you of is the dope sheet. Remember that that can be very helpful. Again, if you have all your controls selected and you go to Windows, Animation Editor, Dope Sheet, what you're going to notice is that, once again, I've got a lot of different controls on this character, a lot of things I need to keep, a lot of different animation controls that I have to keep track of. Now, if I don't want to initially think about the animation curves and the slow in, slow out, and all of that, the dope sheet can be very, very useful because it will really help you with your timing. So because I'm not working with the animation curves themselves, you can see that all these different key poses that I have in, in my file here, that let's say that I want the jump to take a little bit longer than it's currently taking, I can easily come in here into my dope sheet, grab all of the keys, and give it a little bit more time. Like if I want to add 1, 2, 3, 4 frames, let's say, I'll just move these keys over 4 frames and maybe move these keys as well over 1, 2, 3, 4 frames, and you can see that this tool, the dope sheet, makes working with your timing very, very easy, especially before we really get into the nitty-gritty of animating, where we start working with all of these in-betweens from our different main keyframes here. So I spent a little bit more time on my animation and I worked on the in-betweens, those keyframes between my main keyframes that I set earlier. And here is what I have now. I'll go ahead and play it. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what I've done here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I set up a specific camera to be working to, and that's the camera that we're currently looking through, a camera that I named My Camera. By establishing that camera, I can really work on the silhouette of my character. I want the silhouette to be strong because that will read much more clearly for my audience. You can appreciate that if you were to, let's say, look at the character from another angle, maybe like this one, and you can appreciate perhaps that this would not be the most clear silhouette for our audience, that the silhouette here will read perhaps a little more clearly for our audience. Also, because I set up my camera, I can work to that camera. A couple of other things I'd like to point out with my animation and things that you should be also thinking about is that oftentimes you're going to want to avoid symmetry of your character. Having something that's maybe a little more asymmetrical as far as the pose oftentimes will make for a more interesting form. Other things that you can think about in your animation is all those 12 principles. If we look at a few of those 12 principles with this animation, you'll see that I have anticipation of my animation. In other words, the character anticipates their jump by going down first before going up into their action. Throughout the animation, I'm still thinking about trying to have strong silhouettes so that the animation reads clearly for my audience. So I'm thinking about that too as the character comes up to the top of their jump here, at the apex of their jump. Another thing to consider, another one of the 12 principles, is follow through overlapping action. So in other words, not everything happens at once. We can see follow through overlapping action in many instances of this animation, but one that I'll point out would be if you think about the hips, the spine, and the head. Notice that they all don't move at exactly the same time. That in this case, the body starts going down, the spine starts rotating a little after, and then the head follows. It's very subtle here. Character jumps up. Notice that the left arm is starting to go up. Now the right arm starts to go up. Not everything is happening at exactly the same time. Character comes down. Follow through overlapping action. Not everything happens at once. Hips come down. Legs meet the ground. Hips continue coming down. Spine starts to bend. Head bends. Character comes back up. Again, notice how the spine and the head are offset a little bit from one another, as well as the hands. Not everything happens at exactly the same time. Also notice that I've tried to introduce a little bit of an offset from the left and the right arm as well. One other thing that I would suggest for your jump animations is leave a few frames at the end here so that it gives your audience a little time to catch up and see what's happened, so that the character is not just in continuous movement. That you want in your animation to start in a strong pose, an interesting pose that evokes something of your character that you're animating. You want to have your character go into the anticipation. You want your character to jump up, come up to their apex, come down, land on the ground, uh, react to that using follow through overlapping action, and then come back to maybe more of a resting state, and then leave a few more frames so that your audience can take it all in. So good luck with your jump animation. Um, Keep in mind the advice that I've given you. I think it does help make the task more manageable of animating a character, which can get quite complicated, again, because of the numerous controls on a character. But if you follow some of those pointers, some of those tips, it'll make it a much more manageable and enjoyable process for you. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.